So
we just need to, figure out if the sound is working at some point.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see. Is that going to, or do we need to raise that a little bit more? Do you want me to sit on the chair and see?
Yeah, sure. I think that if I can just like angle. Yeah, so if it'll stay like that, then you can come look, you can see yourself. You look great. You look very thoughtful. Okay, now look radical. Now look radical. Okay, good. All right, so let me just pull up the live stream on screen. Okay, see if I can get the sound. Okay. Like everyone hear me like clomping around. It seems that, yeah, I mean, I could hear people talking. Let me see if it's still going. Yeah, it's going.
Oh, yeah. I can, yeah, because I have a Twitter thing here. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we might just as well go ahead and get started. Welcome, everyone, to the first annual meeting of the sub-conference of the Modern Language Association Convention. We, on behalf of the organizing committee, we're all thrilled that you all could make it, and there will be, I imagine, many others passing through this room over the next 2 days. There were, last count, 105 or 107 people who had registered for the conference, and there were a number of others who had told us that they would be coming here and attending at least a few of the panels. So we'll be running all day today and tomorrow. And what I want to do is to kind of introduce the conference a bit and very quickly in a summary way, but had a few announcements first. First, if you are on Twitter, the official Twitter handle of the MLA Subconference is MLA Subcon, which is MLA SUBCON. So any tweeters You're welcome to tweet away. There have been several requests for live tweeting from people on Twitter the past couple days. We are also on live streaming this event on Ustream. There's a Ustream channel that we set up a couple days ago. Obviously, you all are here, but if you have friends who are elsewhere who would like to view it, we put up the link to the Ustream on our Facebook page. And if you aren't able to make it for some of the rest of the conference, then you can check it out on Ustream yourself. We want to say a big thank you to the Part-Time Faculty Association of Columbia College, who's very graciously hosting and partnering with us to make this possible. They've been delightful partners in helping to really make it happen. And Brianne Bolin, in particular, organizer and a teacher here at Columbia College, has been fantastic. And Diana Valera, the president of PFAC. We also want to say a thank you to, of all things, Revolution Brewing up in Logan Square. We have an open bar today, which I'll mention in a moment. And Revolution Brewing has graciously donated 8 cases of beer to the open bar in the spirit of fraternity and solidarity, I suppose. And so speaking of open bar, scintillating topic, it is today at 6:30. It'll be at 600 South Michigan in the 8th floor faculty lounge, which is different from what it actually says in the program. It says Ferguson Hall. It still is at 6:30, but if you want to maybe cross that out and write in 8th floor faculty lounge as well. We'll also be announcing it later on today, so that and have signs to where it's going, to where it'll be. Lunch day will be catered by Whole Foods, of all things, so stick around for that. It's free. And there are another couple of changes to the program. One, we are very sorry to learn just this morning that Mark Bosquet is ill and is actually not coming to the MLA this year and won't be able to appear on the plenary tomorrow. It's very unfortunate. He's a terrific speaker. We are working on someone to substitute for him, and he is as well. And we'll have more details on that probably today. Also, Ty Moore in the Mobilizing Precarity panel is also ill and won't be able to attend. However, he was able to arrange a colleague of his to appear on the panel, Kat Salonik of Occupy Homes and Socialist Alternative up in Minneapolis, I believe. Okay, so yeah, I was going to read the collective statement that the organizing committee came up with back in September, but I think instead of doing that, which is on the website, on the front page, everyone can go read it. I think maybe what would be better is just to get started with the panels, and but maybe first of all, just also maybe have a collective acknowledgement of the organizing committee. So we are 8 grad students from 5 different universities: Virginia, Chicago, UW-Madison, Wayne State, and Duke. And somehow it all magically came together. It's been a very smooth organizing process, free of rancor and discord, almost completely. And I'm really happy that we were able to pull it off and be here today. So without further ado, we'll move on to the first panel, which is Education in a Time of Mass Incarceration.
Yeah. So thank you guys so much for coming. We might as well get started with our first panel. And so we have, I'm not going to be able to say your last name, Janelle Polchinsky, and Colleen Lucy, who both are part of the Writers in Prison project. So Colleen Lucy is a PhD candidate in Slavic languages and literature at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her dissertation examines the portrayal of marginal women in 19th century Russian literature and visual culture. In addition to teaching courses on Russian language and literature at UW-Madison, she has worked as an instructor at Oak Hill Correctional Institution since 2010. Janelle Polchinsky is a dissertator in the Department of Comparative Literature and Folklore Studies at UW-Madison. She works on modern literature in English, Arabic, Armenian, Spanish, and French. Her primary disciplinary focus is on the intersection of gender, race, and media. She is particularly interested in how media affects stereotypes of marginalized groups. Her dissertation is tentatively titled Social Education, Social Justice, Reading Circles as Gateways to Alternative Forms of Civic Engagement. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. So my name is Colleen, and I'm from UW-Madison, and I've been at Oak Hill, as Laura said, since 2010. And Janelle?
My name is Janelle Polchinsky, and I'm also a dissertator at the University of Wisconsin in comparative literature.
Okay, and so we'd like to speak briefly about our involvement at Oak Hill. And I first received a grant from the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a Humanities Exposed grant, to teach a course on creative writing and fiction reading. And this was in 2010, and I took over a course that was established by Naomi Olsen. And since then, I've led courses on Eastern European drama, creative writing, as well as courses on Eastern European drama and literature in general. And then I joined with Janelle in 2011, I should say, for the fiction reading course on Friday evenings.
And I also started working at the prison in June of 2010. We started the fiction reading course November of 2010, largely in part thanks to a HEX grant that I received in collaboration with another of our colleagues, Laura Bastian. I want to talk a little bit just about the way we both got involved in fiction, in working with Oak Hill, and how we started the fiction reading course, and how that kind of corresponds to what I'm doing right now in my dissertation. So it's really interesting. One of the people that we admire very much in terms of working with prisons is Jody Lewin, who is the executive director of the Prison University Project at San Quentin out in California. She, in 2012, came to the University of Wisconsin-Madison to speak at the Public Humanities conference that we had. She also wrote an article in 2008 for the PMLA that was titled Academics Belong in Prison on Creating University at San Quentin. What I want to share with you is just a little piece about what she mentioned in terms of her own involvement in her work at San Quentin Prison and the Prison University Project there. And I mention it because there's a lot of very similar parallels to how I started my own work in the prison system in Wisconsin. She was basically at a conference. She overheard a conversation about people talking about the volunteer projects at San Quentin. She decided on a whim to kind of just start teaching a class there. She always thought it would be a hobby. And then when she wrote about her involvement in San Quentin in the article that I mentioned in 2008, what she says is, meeting that first group of bright, motivated, hardworking, and deeply appreciative students defied all my negative expectations and ultimately changed my entire life. And I think that's really interesting in terms of just how it corresponds with what I'm doing as well. Like I said, I started working in the prison on a whim. I met Laurel as a friend of a friend, and she was like, "Hey, I'm looking for somebody to help ghostwrite this grant for me to work in the prison." I was like, "Hey, I want to work outside of academia. It sounds like fun. I'll ghostwrite it for you. I'm happy to run a class." And what's kind of ensued since that, and that was in 2009, we started writing the grant in 2009. Like I said, I started teaching in 2010. And what's kind of ensued from that has pretty much changed my entire academic career. Like Laura mentioned, my dissertation is now revolving around social education through reading circles, so how people read together as an alternative form of civic engagement. And so I think the parallels are really interesting in terms of how Jody Lewin got started and how I did, and a little bit ironic. And Colleen and I started, like she mentioned, started working together in the fall of 2011, and we've been co-facilitating this reading class together for the past since that time.
So Oak Hill Correctional Facility is a minimum security prison in Oregon, Wisconsin. And what we'd like to share with you is one of the first testimonials that we'll be sharing with you today, which kind of gives you a small glimpse of what the classes mean to the incarcerated individuals at Oak Hill. So, as we normally think in our classrooms, as teachers, as instructors, or in community as community involvers, we think of dialogue as something that is quintessential to communication, something that is not only understanding for ourselves, but in order to understand other human beings. What we find in the prison is that's not something that's actually valued. So what we're offering is a safe space in which people, incarcerated individuals, can communicate with one another outside of the prison yard. So here's a quote from one of our participants. "Prison is a place where kindness and compassion are taken as a sign of weakness, and it's nice to be reminded that there are people who care enough about us to share their time with us, to have stimulating conversation in an otherwise unstimulating environment." And actually, stimulating conversation is something that we probably don't find many places anymore. I find that probably the stimulating conversation is something that is leaving American discourse in general, and actually the place of academia should be to engage and intervene. And what we found at Oak Hill are interesting moments of intervention, in which not only can the men inform us, we can inform them as well. It's a back and forth. The history, and then today's agenda, Janelle will give us.
Yeah. So I'm just going to give you a little brief overview of what we're going to talk about over the next 45 minutes or so. We'll try and get us back on track in terms of time. We've already gone through the introduction. Colleen is going to additionally just give you a brief background of the Oak Hill Correctional Institute where we work. We'll talk a little bit about the prison industrial complex in general. We'll look at the courses at Oak Hill and focus specifically on the Friday class because that's the one we're most familiar with. We'll look at the benefits of volunteer courses, and we'll talk about getting involved in your own in classes in your own area if you're interested in doing.
Right. Oak Hill Correctional Institution. As I mentioned, it's a minimum security prison in Oregon, Wisconsin. It's about a 30-minute drive from Madison. And as you see here, it kind of looks like a prison, and it kind of doesn't. So it's situated on 100 acres of lush Wisconsin farmland. There's a working farm that's connected with the prison. And as you drive along the path to Oak Hill, the path itself is lined with these lush oak trees. And it's a quite jarring experience and a stark juxtaposition with the lives of incarcerated individuals, because it looks more like actually a college campus than a prison that holds roughly from 600 to 800 men. And part of this disconnect is because it wasn't actually originally built as a prison. It was originally a school for girls. And it was built in the 1940s, and a school probably for, we would consider, wayward girls. But in the 70s, when the push to incarcerate more individuals and the prison industrial complex grew, the need for more prisons, of course, also grew. And so the prison itself changed hands from one form of incarceration, one form of lockup, to a more punitive one, we could say. And currently there are several courses running at Oak Hill. We should mention that there are two types of courses. There are GED courses and courses that give credit, and there are also the non-credit courses. These are the ones that Janelle and I and the other volunteers that we'll mention are associated with. Courses run the gamut between creative writing, fiction reading, memoir writing, poetry reading, and they run basically every evening. And I guess I will now switch to, I'll go ahead and speak briefly about the prison industrial complex. Now, there has never been more need for advocacy of inmate rights for educational programs in prisons. Statistically speaking, and I'm probably saying things that you already know, and forgive me if I'm already doing that, if I'm doing that, but the United States has the highest rate of incarceration in the world. In the state of Wisconsin alone, the prison population has more than tripled since 1990. And most of this tripling and most of this push to incarcerate individuals has been fueled by tougher drug enforcement rather than treatment. Also, the privatization of prison construction, harsher mandatory minimum sentencing laws, concentrated policing in minority communities, and state incarceration for minor probation and supervision violations. So all of these stricter rules have pushed and actually formulated a situation in which we incarcerate individuals at the highest rate in the world. And now, it's commonly known that Hispanic and African American individuals make a much higher rate of nationwide prison population than the general population. But what is less acknowledged is Wisconsin's mass incarceration of African American men. According to recent studies based on the 2010 U.S. Census, Wisconsin has the highest black male incarceration rate in the country. Nearly 13%, or roughly 1 in 8 African American men in Wisconsin are imprisoned. Now that's a rate that's twice the national average. In Milwaukee County, over half of African American men in their 30s have served time in state prison. We look also at our population of Native American men. Wisconsin also leads the nation. So 7.6%, nearly 8% of working age men, or roughly 1 in 13 Native American men in Wisconsin, are serving time in state prisons. Now this is compared to 3%, or 1 in 32 nationally. By contrast, if we look at the rate of incarceration of Caucasian men, Wisconsin is pretty much on par with the nation. And upon release, we find that incarcerated individuals have an even more difficult time entering their communities. And I'd like to share with you a quote from a recent study by Michelle Alexander. Her new book is entitled New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. And she writes, "Today it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon to old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the rights to vote, denial of educational opportunity, denial of food stamps and other public benefits, and exclusion from jury service. These are all suddenly legal. As a criminal, you have scarcely more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama in the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it." Michelle Alexander aptly describes the legalization of a modern caste system here. And currently, we exclude a huge portion of our society from active engagement in their communities upon release. And the current system of mass incarceration in America is all the more unjust because most inmates have been sorely let down by the public education system. On average, adults incarcerated in American federal and state correctional facilities have less than an 8th grade education, and a staggering number are illiterate. So with these statistics in mind, keeping in mind the prison industrial complex, keeping in mind the mass incarceration of African Americans, particularly in Wisconsin, volunteers from UW-Madison reached out to Oak Hill Prison Administration with the hope of offering educational opportunities to incarcerated individuals. Now, the benefit of education to inmates is well documented, and Janelle will speak about those benefits in more detail.
So first of all, I just want to start out and talk a little bit about the general benefits of education as it's been documented in reports and articles in the past, and then we'll talk a little bit about the benefits both to the participants and the volunteers for the people who have been involved in the Oak Hill Correctional Project, which is now titled the Oak Hill Prison Humanities Project. We'll talk a little bit about the name change in a few minutes. But as Colleen mentioned, the benefits of education for incarcerated individuals has increased, has shown some increase in reentry and in other social skills for our incarcerated individuals. Some of those that are listed up here. So men and women who have been incarcerated and who have participating in education programs in their own prisons are less likely to engage in violent behavior. They're more likely to find and maintain employment upon parole. And they're less likely to have their parole revoked once they've been released into their communities. And the salary rates of those who have who have participated in educational programs are on average higher than those who do not participate in those educational programs in general. The benefits to participants and facilitators in particular to the volunteers who have participated in the groups that we've been facilitating since 2005 when the courses first began are listed here. And we've included here a quote again from Jody Lewin. Do you want to do okay. That just kind of highlights the benefits for the participant or for the volunteer participant in specific. She writes, again, this is in the 2008 article she writes for the PMLA, the tremendous pleasure of teaching combined with a rapid recognition of the transformative impact of this work causes many teachers to reevaluate the often peripheral or at least secondary role of teaching in their own academic and professional lives. I find this quote to be rather poignant, primarily because this is one of the main reasons that I started teaching in a prison myself. I felt a little bit disengaged and within academia when I was teaching, and I really wanted to be a part of a group that I could connect with and that I could find myself being challenged with in terms of teaching skills, in terms of the kinds of discussions that we have in the class, and in terms of pushing myself further in the way that I can as an educator. So Colleen's going to talk a little bit about the benefits for the volunteers, and then she'll come back to me and I'll talk about the participant benefits.
Okay, so we all know from our own experience that teachers can change your life, right? And teaching, as you become a teacher probably in academia, or you are an instructor, or you have mentorship relationships, we find that those, at least for myself, are quite rewarding experiences. And what I would say is teaching at Oak Hill is something completely different from an academic model in many ways. The men are absolutely there ready to learn. But what oftentimes happens is that you learn much more about yourself in these classes and about what is successful in the classroom than you would necessarily in an academic setting, or a traditional academic setting, I would say. And part of this is because the students themselves are enthusiastic. Now, they want to be there, they want to learn, they themselves realize that they have been disenfranchised by educational programs to date, that they are incarcerated individuals. Oftentimes, when you mention that you work in a prison and that you teach literature, one common response is, well, I mean, they've got a lot of time on their hands, right? So, of course, they're going to be very excited to be in your class. Well, what I would say to that is that actually we have quite steep competition from other organizations. Now, the men could be on private personal visits. The men could be in the sports rec room. They could be playing basketball. They could also be doing different programs, Read to Me, in which they record themselves and send tapes to their loved ones. There's a job center. So these men are they are self-selective that come to these courses, particularly because they want to increase their verbal and critical language skills. And they realize, now they come for different reasons, but that in the end, I think, is what leads them to stay. In terms of facilitating skills, my experience in the classroom, when you're teaching language, normally I would teach Russian language, you can force people to speak because it's part of the syllabus. They're required to. But when you're facilitating the literature discussion, now you always have people that will probably not want to engage in discussion. And it can be difficult to coax them and have them express their own opinion. What we find at Oak Hill is that the men are really ready and so happy that somebody will listen to their ideas and engage them on the level of the text, right? Their interpretation of the text has value. Because for most of their lives, probably, they've been told that they don't actually have anything to offer in a classroom. Now, of course, experiences differ and they range. But in the prison system, when you engage on a human-to-human level and you ask them to participate in dialogue, what you find is a quite positive response. And in terms of perspective, in terms of what we expect out of students, what I expect out of students, I would say that Oak Hill has radically changed what I think that a classroom can do. And I think that Janelle will probably also talk about what the participants themselves feel about what a classroom, how classrooms can and should be structured, and the benefits of breaking down hierarchical systems and then translating that into your own teaching in academia.
So I want to talk a little bit then about the benefits for the participants themselves. I think anytime you work in the humanities, if any of you here are in the humanities, you know it's kind of an uphill battle to be constantly explaining what it is that has practical value if you teach literature, especially if you're teaching literature in a prison where your classes are not credited. At a university, you can say, well, it's a required course, the students have to take this, and because it has some kind of merit to it, people will accept it a little bit more willingly than a course like this. So I want to just talk a little bit then about what the participants, both in terms of how I understand and how I see the classes being run and how I see what I see the men learning from the classes, but also what they themselves say about the class. So a lot of the list here that I have posted is based on both my experience, but also on conversations that I've had with the men in the classes on a regular basis. I usually try once about every 1 or 2 months to have this conversation, usually at the end of the session, to say, what are you guys learning from this class? What can we do to improve it? What can we do that will better serve your purposes? And so just in terms of the list that we have up on the board right now, critical thinking skills is one of the biggest things that I think the men are really there to hone their skills on, because as Colleen mentioned, they feel a little bit disenfranchised. Most of the men who come into the class are also feeling a little bit suspicious of educational systems because they've had problems with it in the past. And so they get a little bit susceptible or a little bit suspicious about what we're planning on doing in the classes and what we can do to help and kind of push them. What we do is we create a really comfortable environment for them to be able to express their opinions, to be able to talk about things and really push their critical thinking. And it's not necessarily push their critical thinking in terms of that they didn't have it before, but that they didn't feel comfortable expressing it before, because in the past people have always said that, it had given them some kind of reason not to express it. And so I think we see these critical thinking skills coming out as the men stay in the class, as they continue to come to the courses. They become really great debaters and have very insightful conversations. They become much better close readers. And I want to just share an anecdote about one of the classes that I taught. When I first started teaching in 2010, I had 3 men in my class. And we read a short story by David Sedaris called Christmas Whore. And we'd been teaching this, I'd been teaching for maybe about 4 or 5 months at this point. And one of the men came in and was like, oh, this girl, she's so loose, she's such a prostitute. And before I could think to ask him a question of how do you know that? Where are you getting that from the text? The other 2 men in the class asked exactly the questions that I was planning on asking. They're like, well, how do you know she's a whore? Where does it say it in the text? Why don't you tell me in this piece of literature where it says that she is a prostitute? And he was like, oh, well, I guess it's just in the title. And so before I could even say anything, they had the entire conversation by themselves, and I just kind of sat there like a little proud teacher. I was like, you guys are awesome. So they really push their thinking, and they really, base their conversations and their analysis within the text, which is something I don't think that you find. I don't find it anyway in a lot of my classes that I teach at a university. The men are really pushing themselves to think better. The writing skills that they increase when they're in the classes are both creative and analytical. A lot of the courses that are currently running have both a creative writing expert and a literature person to kind of both analyze literature, but then also to give the men a place to foster their own creative writing skills. Our class doesn't necessarily look at creative writing because we don't have someone who's focused on creative writing, but we do occasionally have the students write reflections on reading. We have them write reflections on the course in general and kind of thinking in an abstract, theoretical way. We ask them to write essays occasionally, although they protest a lot when we try to get them to write analytical essays, but they still do increase their writing skills as we kind of go through. Their communication skills are increased both with one another in the classroom and with women in particular, because most of the volunteers in the classes are women, which is something that they don't necessarily have access to, or they have access to it in a different way. They're approaching how they speak to women in a much different way than they would in a social setting, for example. And their creative opportunities and skills are really enhancing these classes as well, and I'm just going to give you a list of some of the places where the men have been able to showcase their own writings. So I believe last year in the Wisconsin Book Festival, some of the men who were in the advanced poetry class submitted some of their writing, either anonymously or with pseudonyms or with their own names, to the Wisconsin Book Festival, and they were, I don't remember what the results were, but there were submissions to that. In addition, we've had some of the volunteers do open mic proxy readings at local bookstores, where the men will write a piece and a volunteer will read it for them anonymously in those settings. Once the men have been released, they've also attended open mics and read their own works there themselves. There was also just recently, I think in the last 6 months, maybe in the springtime, an on-site poetry reading. So the advanced poetry class spent one of their 8-week-long sessions doing writing, and they, at the end of their course, did an on-site poetry reading which was recorded and then played on a local radio station in Madison. And so the men do get a chance to showcase their own work. What I've been sharing with you here is basically my summary of what I understand the men are learning from, but now I wanted to be able to give them their own voices. So I put on here some testimonials from the men, focusing primarily on what they say about what they get from the class. Most of these come from, we just finished up a session on December 20th, and so in the last class I asked them, and Colleen had asked them, what do you get out of these classes? What's the value out of taking any of the classes that you're attending at this particular time? For the just sake of privacy and security, we've kept these anonymous, but they were more than happy to share with us, so I'm going to just give you a couple of them here. So the first one, the participant says, all of these classes are great and get you outside the prison walls and are the only thing in the system that comes even close to preparing you for the day you will be released.
Listening to the opinions of others and expressing my own has become an important part of my preparation for life beyond prison. I see being able to express myself as an important skill for getting along in the free world.
Third, these classes are instrumental in the training of young and old men about the value of human life.
So wise. I enjoy the exchanging of perspectives on contemporary and social issues, including race, gender, and class. We also get a feminine perspective, and that's an important point of view that we couldn't get otherwise.
So I think what you're seeing from a lot of these testimonials may not necessarily be the kind of like practical value that you would get if the men were taking their GED courses or a writing course or a science course, but I think what's really important here and what kind of underlies work in the humanities in general, not just in a prison, but working in humanities across the board, is this understanding of how to interact socially, how to talk to human beings and treat others with respect and dignity, and being able to learn the values and respect the values of others regardless of whether or not you agree with them or come from the same background or perspective. And I think that's really vital to any student who's learning, and not just someone who's been incarcerated. So now Colleen's going to just do a brief background of the courses that have been being run by the volunteers since 2000.
Right. So because Oak Hill is a minimum security prison, and because of its dedication to providing programming, UW volunteers and community volunteers have made a sustainable partnership with the Department of Corrections. Sustainability is something that we long for, and that we hope that these programs at Oak Hill will outlive us. Right? And thankfully, that's part of Oak Hill's mission. Oak Hill is a little bit of an anomaly, I would think. Because if you look at their annual report from this past year, 2013, the mission statement itself says that it will provide programming for individuals. So I'd like to share a brief piece from the mission statement of Oak Hill, so that if you think about doing something similar in your own community, if you research prisons, what prisons are close to your home university, and want to do something similar, if you can go online and find the annual report and look at the mission statement, and see if there's something in the mission statement that states outright that we provide programming for incarcerated individuals. When you approach the educational director and you've done your research and say that it's actually in your mission statement that this is something that I can provide, this will give your case all the more push. So here's from Oak Hill's 2013 annual report. The mission of Oak Hill Correctional Institution is to maintain the safe and secure custody of minimum security offenders and a responsive, supportive, equitable, and quality environment. Offenders will be provided opportunities for positive cognitive and behavioral development and progress through proven, cultural competent programming and treatment. Opportunities also will be provided through fair, consistent, and objective staff decision-making and performance. So thanks in part to this mission statement, we are able, as a group of volunteers loosely connected as a federation, be able to fit ourselves into the programming in Oak Hill. Now, the history of non-credit courses offered at Oak Hill dates back to 2005. And it was in this year that two graduate students, Ray Sue and Marianne Earhart, from the English department at UW-Madison, received a Humanities Exposed grant, a HEX grant, which is what Janelle and I both received at the same year, but for different classes. And they received this HEX grant from the Center for the Humanities for the 2005-2006 academic year. And the graduate students structured a writing course for GED preparation. The GED course, as the men came to the class, what the instructors realized was that the men, rather than just GED instruction, they really wanted creative writing. So this course kind of spun off, rather than just practical GED writing training, to this kind of creative discursive dialogue here in their creative writing course. Now, the following year, in 2006, the first facilitators invited Laurel Bastian, a Madison-based poet and activist, to take over the course. And for many years, Laurel was the driving force behind the organization of the poetry class. And over the following years, she helped foster community interest in the project at Oak Hill and was the primary coordinator for all of the outreach and all the organizational ins and outs of the program. And she, along with Steele Wagstaff, who then took over the brunt of the work, then continued to communicate with the prison administration, which is actually something that can be quite difficult. We can speak about that in the Q&A if you'd like. And organize all of you can imagine 5 different classes with a group of volunteers to coordinate all of those classes together and communicate our needs to the prison administration. Having one person do that, it's a huge job. It was not paid at that time. So they wrote a letter of support for a grant that was written that we'll speak about in just a minute. And I'd like to share a quote from their letter of support, which kind of gives you the breadth of their interest and their belief in the educational programs at Oak Hill. We believe strongly in the value of intelligent, culturally sensitive, and creatively challenging educational programming being available to our incarcerated population. In the course of our involvement at Oak Hill, we have been repeatedly amazed by the hunger for learning, the latent and too often underdeveloped creative potential, and the deep intellectual curiosity and generosity of the hundreds of incarcerated men who have enrolled in our courses. Now, these courses were and continue to be run predominantly, solely by volunteers. UW graduate students and teaching professionals in the Madison area facilitate a variety of courses. And I think Janelle will talk about those courses in more detail.
So before I get into what courses are available to the men, I just want to talk a little bit about how, the logistics of the class, what's set up, how it started, how it's changed, and speak a little bit about, so you can get a picture of where we are in the class when we are actually meeting with the men. All of our classes are held in the schoolroom of the old campus from the girls' school, and so it's this 1940s building that you walk in and it's very much schoolroom, Little House on the Prairie schoolroom, with this tiny little chalkboard and very heavy but movable desks and not much else in the classrooms themselves. The course is set up. Originally the men were allowed to enroll in the class at any time, and it was a continuing enrollment. So whoever was interested in coming to the class just talked to the educational director, and the educational director's assistant signed up for the course, and then once their name was listed on the roster, they could come into the class. If they chose not to attend anymore, if they missed more than 2 classes, their names were taken off the list. If they were transferred or released, they were taken off the list as well, and their books were returned to the educational department. What's changed recently in the past is that all courses have now been streamlined and pushed over to 8-week sessions. So we're all now start and end at the same time. We all go for 8 weeks. For most classes, I think that's very beneficial in terms of being able to reuse course materials, to be able to keep some kind of stability, and then to get a higher attrition rate within the classes so we can attract more of the inmates themselves. For the Friday fiction class, it isn't so conducive, but we've conceded and compromised in order to help streamline the project itself. It's more, I believe it's more difficult for us because we read novels, and it's just really hard to get more than 2 novels into the reading over the course of 8 weeks. Not necessarily because we go very slowly through the text, but because the men also have a lot of things that they're doing. A lot of them are working, attending 2 or 3 other classes and doing work for those, and then doing their own creative writing work or work on the science as well. So it becomes, it just becomes difficult to kind of try and squish anything more than 2 novels within an 8-week session, but we're going to try it next time, so we'll see how it goes. We can expect anywhere between 5 and 15 men in the course. Sometimes there's been as many as 25 in some of the more popular classes. A lot of times this just depends on the course content itself, what kind of books are being taught, what's the interest, and the PR that we have available, but mainly the word of mouth that goes through. A lot of the men who are in one class are in 2 or 3 of the other classes. If they have friends or colleagues or that are in the system with them, they usually just spread around, say, you guys should come to this class, it's really interesting. We do have posters that we put up in the schoolroom and around the prison complex so that they can read a short summary of here's what we're reading this upcoming week. They have to sign up at least a week before the courses begin, and they're committed to attending all 8 weeks of the course. The courses that we have available, on Monday it's the advanced poetry class. This class is the one that was originally started in 2005 that Laurel ran for quite some time, that Steele then took over and is now still being successfully run by poets from UW-Madison. The Tuesday night class has kind of changed. It's in the process of kind of shifting. It was a memoir class. It's now becoming a memoir, Slavic literature, creative writing, kind of jack of all trades course that's available. Wednesday is an African American Studies class that was started with the grant that I received in 2010. So Laurel and I collaboratively set up the Friday class and the Wednesday classes. She pretty much took over the administrative portions of the Wednesday class, and I did with the Friday classes. Currently, the Thursday night class is available because 2 of the classes joined together in order to try and get a higher enrollment in their classes, although there are rumors of a possible Chicano literature class starting up in the near future, so we're hoping that that one gets filled pretty quickly. And then, of course, the Friday class is the fiction reading course that we run. I want to talk a little bit about what we've read in that class. We mainly focus on novels, primarily, and how we choose our text is really just a matter of what we're interested in. When I first started, like I mentioned, I had 3 men in the class, and I started with a book that I really liked. And I just kind of set up the course as a open environment to just read together. And I kind of build it as this is going to be a book club, and this is how we're going to do it. So I don't necessarily like talking about it as a class, because I think, as Colleen mentioned earlier, I learn much more from the men than I probably teach them. And so it's more of, I think of it in terms of as a reading circle. And so I started suggesting, and then I asked, every session that we ask, what are you guys interested in reading? What would you like to read next? What are you interested in looking at? And they're always full of suggestions. If they don't have specific novels or stories or plays they want to read, they'll say, well, can we do some short stories next? What about drama? Can we do a play and then perform it at the end of the week? That was the last suggestion that we had. Can we do a book-movie combo where we read a book and then watch the film and talk about analyze the differences in the media in that kind of sense? So we've covered everything from novels to, we just recently did a graphic novel, which was difficult to get past the administrative system, but we got it in anyway. And the men they didn't necessarily like the format. They had a lot to say about the text itself, and so it generated a lot of interesting conversation. We've read plays, we've read short stories, we've read poems, and we've read nonfiction. And if you guys have specific questions about any specific things that we've read, we'll go through it in the Q&A. But I don't want to spend a lot of time on looking at specific things that we've read. What's coming up in the next session, which I'm actually really excited about, we're starting on January 31st, And we're going to be starting out with The Farming of Bones by Edward Downicott. Then we're going to move to Albert Camus' The Stranger. And we're doing a novel Clive Sala's Season of Migration to the North, which is, he's an African novelist, and it's I think it's going to be a really interesting pairing and challenging for me to be able to keep up with in that particular piece. So that's what we're reading next. One of the changes that has come with the grant that we brought, and Colleen's going to talk in a minute about the grant that we've read, is we've also started to incorporate a course fair. In the next week, I believe, all of the volunteers, a representative from each of the classes will be going to Oak Hill. In the morning, we'll have a 2-hour course fair in which each participant, each representative has 15 minutes to talk about the upcoming course. We're getting posters. We'll have syllabi, which I don't know if we can hand out yet or not. They have to be approved. But we'll have the men will have the chance to listen to. Here's what our class is. We give a little bit of a trailer of come and join our class. This will be really interesting. And the men then will also have a chance to ask questions about the courses themselves. This was started by the facilitator of all of the classes now, who is now funded by project assistance, thanks to the grant that Colleen's going to talk about here in just a second. So she set all of this up in an effort to increase enrollment in some of the classes.
Okay, so excuse me. Before we talk about the grant, the Wisconsin Idea Grant that we received, I'll talk about the Friday Fiction Reading course, our mission statement, which is also in line with the other courses at Oak Hill. So part of this grant is that since everything has been streamlined, the courses at Oak Hill have a common mission statement that we, as facilitators across the different courses, helped create. So the first goal for the Friday class is to facilitate critical thinking and encourage the development of language skills among course participants. And now this is important because we're engaging them on subjects that normally they wouldn't be engaged on, right? So we're asking them to express themselves, and we're asking them to also have a dialogue with one another. And now this is important because this is something that's outside of the normal day-to-day routine and the normal conversation that they would have, I think, in the prison yard. It's a safe space in which people can express their ideas. And the second is to provide practical training in writing, reading, and communicative skills that will prepare participants for successful careers and lives upon release. Now, we know that reading and writing, of course, is a must for anybody applying for a job. What more to humanize people but to tell them how it is to be human by reading text, right? So that's part also of the Friday class. The third is to offer participants a safe and open environment in which to express ideas, encounter new perspectives, and become better listeners. Oftentimes in the classroom, when somebody disagrees with an interpretation of a text, rather than actually engage one another, it becomes an argument. So what happens is like a breakdown of conversation, a breakdown of dialogue, communication. And what we find as facilitators is that our first job is to actually try to deflate the tension and to ask people to, and if they disagree with us, they feel strange. They feel uncomfortable that they're actually the only way to engage with someone is through argument, if you disagree. Actually, we're trying to shift the dialogue there and say that there's a way to engage that isn't argumentative, even when you disagree. Now this, I think, is one of the most beneficial aspects of the course. And then finally, is to raise public awareness about the need for higher education in prisons across America. And we should, of course, thank the organizers of this conference for inviting us to participate today. And I'm sorry we didn't mention that earlier on, but I would like now to segue and intervene and say thank you so much for inviting us and for the audience members to engage with us at this moment and to listen to our project. Now I'm going to move to the grant. Okay. The Wisconsin Idea Grant. Okay. Excuse me. So, as I mentioned before, the classes at Oak Hill, totally run by volunteers, right? The money that we had was substantial in the fact that it covered materials. The grant that we received, the Public Humanities Exchange at UW. Now, that grant would last us for approximately 2 years. It was geared for 1 year, but I mean, besides materials and gas money, there's not really anything that you're paying for, right? The students aren't paying you to come there, right? So it's not a for-profit educational system, which is also something that's wonderful. And so this money was volunteer run, like money was connected to volunteer status, right? It didn't pay for instructors, right? It just paid for gas and materials. But what we found is that the money runs out eventually, so volunteers would just pay out of pocket for materials, or liberate materials from your home apartment. I would find one thing, right? Redistribution of wealth here. But with the help of the outgoing chair at the Slavic department at UW-Madison, Judith Kornblatt, who wrote the grant application, the Wisconsin Idea Grant, which is a competitive grant that staff, faculty, and students can apply for at UW, which is allocated over 2 years. With her, thanks to her effort, she advocated for our cause, and we received the grant, which is close to $100,000. So you can imagine going from $2,000 for 2 years to $100,000 to offset administrative costs, material costs, transportation, publicity. This is a large step. It's a large growth period for us. Now, with the help of this grant, we were given a PA-ship, project assistantship, which the current PA, her name is Naomi Olson, and thanks to her great work, we now have we have publicizing opportunities, we have somebody communicating on our behalf to the prison administration, we have somebody that's uploaded an entire UW webpage for instructors to download and upload their materials, there's forums for one another, there's a handbook, and what this grant really has done for us is to organize the longevity of the program itself. Because before, it was a grassroots movement, right? Like I said, kind of like a loose confederacy of volunteers who minimally communicated with one another. And now things have become much more streamlined so that we have an advocate who expresses our needs to the prison administration through the DOC, and also can communicate their needs to us. So the communication has been streamlined, and the courses themselves have been streamlined. We also, with the thanks of this grant, have a faculty mentor. This person is also supposed to aid and advise and mentorship and oversee the program in general. With this grant opportunity, however, because it was a grassroots from the very beginning, to move to a large-scale operation, things, of course, have needed to change. And I think Janelle will talk about those changes in more detail.
So as you can understand, like a grassroots organization that's pretty much run on volunteer gas, primarily, switching over to something that's given a large amount of funding can cause some issues to arise that make the problems a little bit more problematic than what had been going on before. And I'm sure as you understand, people don't really like change, especially when it's change that they may not necessarily understand the change from an individual perspective. And I think what happens a lot of times is that we forget about the big picture goal, and so because we forget about the big picture and we're more thinking about the current here and now, a lot of the volunteers have had some problems compromising and switching over with the new grant money. There have been issues also with just kind of adjusting to a new lifestyle, as you will, as a program together. As Colleen mentioned, it has been streamlined, it's been made more efficient. But I want to talk about 3 of the main issues that I see kind of arising because of this grant money, which we're grateful for. I want to end on a positive note, but I also want to point out that it isn't just sunshine and flowers when you get lots of money. So the first issue that we have is collaboration. I think as most of the volunteers are UW graduate students, we're all in academia, and I think inherently academia teaches us to be self-sufficient, but also to be competitive and therefore anti-collaborative. And it makes it really hard to work within a group that's trying to collaborate and create a big project when you are being taught to be self-sufficient and not work with one another. There's several layers to this collaboration. First, working within a classroom itself and collaborating with other volunteers. I didn't mention this before, but all of the courses are required to have at least 2 volunteers in it at all times. Our Friday class has 6 volunteers. I'm the lead facilitator, which means I kind of run the schedule and get everyone's things put together. And so everyone has different teaching styles. We all have different agendas for being in the class. Trying to streamline those agendas and getting enough of a balance between not only us as very opinionated graduate students in a comfortable forum to be able to facilitate a class and know when we need to step forward and facilitate and know when we need to step back and allow the participants themselves to be able to talk has been a really, I think we've been very fortunate in that Colleen and I have very similar philosophies on teaching, very similar passion for this project, that it's been a relatively easy switchover for us to do it and to integrate the new volunteers who have similar philosophies on teaching and reasons for being part of the program itself. So we're collaborating within the classroom, both with the volunteers but also with the participants, because primarily we're there for the men. And I think sometimes when we get really excited about books, we tend to forget that we're there not just because so we can hear ourselves talk, but so that we can allow a space for the men to voice their opinions too. Sometimes it gets a little bit crazy in the classroom. So we need to take a step back in terms of collaboration there. Another thing that's emerged from this, from the grant money, however, is in an effort to streamline the courses. Naomi Olson has tried to set up a lot of workshops in which we can do best practices with the other volunteers for the other classes. Prior to this grant, we didn't collaborate a lot with the other volunteers in the other classes that are running on different nights. We basically turned our stuff in, did our own thing, and everything ran smoothly, and we kind of were individual entities within the classes. Because of this grant, we're trying to kind of streamline it so that in the future it's more efficient and there's a lot of resources for all of the volunteers who are involved. Because of the idea of collaboration, I think, and because, and I'll get into this point too, because we started these individually and they've kind of become our little babies, it makes it really hard for us to both give it up but also find the time to be able to collaborate with others and to workshop and understand that the purpose of workshopping is to be able to share our ideas and make the courses better than they are now than to just kind of sit and like throw some ideas around. So learning to collaborate across the classrooms has become a difficulty too. And finally, learning to collaborate across a hierarchy, I think, is something that we didn't see before we had this funding. There are a number of different groups invested in this program at this point. So at the bottom level, it's the volunteers who are running the courses. Then we have the project assistant who did teach classes in 2009 but has been absent since 2009-2010. So she's kind of coming in with fresh eyes, which can be an advantage, but also from the volunteer's perspective, if she hasn't been there for 3 years, she's doing a lot of catching up to try and like get back on track of what the prison dynamics are at this point, and then from an administrative point of view. Then we have the faculty mentor who also has a stake in it and may have a different stake than the PA does, than the volunteers do. There's Oak Hill administration who has their own agendas behind that, and they've taken the opportunity that the grant has provided to help streamline and add some more changes into the classes, some of them which we think are very efficient, some of them which we're having a hard time adjusting to, but it's working with that. Also working with the hierarchy of the university, because it's a university-funded grant. The university officials have a stake in this as well, and the funding source too. So because it's a grant, there are certain ways we have to be held accountable for the money that we're using. And I think a lot of times, because we don't have our hands in the process of it as volunteers, we miss that particular part, and we tend to miss what the overall goal is for the courses itself. I mentioned a little bit about ownership. Like I said, I'm going to be brief here because I know we're running close to our end. We do tend to be a little bit territorial about our classes, and it's not necessarily because we don't want other people to be part of it, but because we've been so invested in it. And we've done numerous, Colleen and I have spent 4 years on these projects that have been, and so they're near and dear to our hearts, and it's very hard to kind of let go of that and allow somebody and be vulnerable enough to allow somebody to come in and help us become better project coordinators or better volunteers in the class itself. So I think, again, it's often hard to see that our end goals are all the same. The final piece that I want to talk about is this idea of publicity. And Colleen mentioned this a little bit about advocating and pushing forward. the publicity that we've received because of the grant, we've gotten a lot of people have been writing articles about us. There's been a documentary made by some of the courses. People have contacted us, more people have contacted us about becoming volunteers or about making documentaries or about filming the classes themselves. Some of these are really good ways to advocate for the course, and I think I am very grateful that people have taken such a big interest in what we're doing here. However, we have to be really careful with how to handle that publicity because those supporters may have different agendas than we do. Our primary agenda is really to be there for the participants, for the men themselves. And one of the guidelines that we have is really about protecting them. And it sounds really weird to talk about prison inmates as victims, but they become essentialized a lot and they become taken advantage of because they don't have a lot of control over who comes into the classroom, over who comes into the prison to talk to them, and they don't have any control about how that end product becomes aired or publicized or taken out of context once it's all said and done, once those interviewers have left the prison building. And so I want to again go back to Jody Lewin. She quotes again talking about the inception of the San Quentin Prison University Project, which also started out as a volunteer program. She says, the program's marginality was also one of its greatest strengths. No state or federal funding meant nothing could be reduced or eliminated. Its lack of money meant there was nothing to attract any individual or institution that was solely in search of a profit. Now the profit that I'm talking about isn't necessarily monetary profit, but there's still some people contacting us who are maybe in it not necessarily for the same reasons that we have started these programs. I don't want to end on the negative of like, here are all the bad things about getting funding, because I do believe overall this grant has been a really great advantage for us. It's streamlined our issues, it's streamlined the classes itself, and it's made it more efficient, especially for the administration at the prison. It's made it more efficient for us for us as volunteers and taken off a lot of the time consumption and monetary pressure that we've had in terms of trying to find funding for the courses itself. So the issues do exist, especially if we just start thinking about short-term in the here and now. Because the goal is longevity and sustainability, I think once we remember that, thinking about this project as a whole of what's going to happen 10 years down the road or even 2 years down the road when Colleen and I hopefully finish our dissertations and aren't here anymore, that the classes will still be run efficiently and competently after we leave. And one of the final things, the end goal is to really include compassion and humanity into these men's lives. And so we're going to talk a little bit next about how you can incorporate prison outreach programs.
Okay, so I will go through all of these very quickly because we are very close to running out of time, and we'd like very much to hear your questions and your comments. So first thing, thanks to the prison industrial complex, most likely you have a prison close to your home institution or to your area community. So I would say first things first is research your local prisons. As I mentioned earlier, you can find all of this material online, download their annual reports there. They should have them online. Find the mission statement, go to the mission statement, see if there's something about educational programming. Gear yourself into that. Second, research already existing outreach organizations. You don't want to reinvent the wheel going to the prison, redoing work others are already giving. So you would be well suited to actually investigate what outreach programs, and probably they do exist, what educational programs already are instituted at this particular facility. And find out whether or not you can fit yourself or bill yourself as something that would be a positive addition to ongoing programs there. Third, research public humanities grants. Janelle and I were lucky enough, and UW is lucky enough to have an organization that awards these startup grants. Something with the increased publicity of public humanities, there's possibly startup grants at your home institution. Research them and see whether or not they provide funding. Also, you might want to contact your home department. Now, this is something that both Janelle and I have encountered, that once our home departments find out what we're doing, they're actually quite invested because they see the positive benefits to the community and also to you as a teacher and their department and to the university as a whole. In terms of materials, okay, if you don't find a grant, you don't have to find a grant. If you have to pay out of pocket, maybe we suggest that you contact publishers or local bookstores. As as Janelle has done, public bookstores and publishers have offered materials free of charge a lot of the time. Wisconsin has a big read program. That means that the university pushes one particular book each year in order for all of the undergraduate classes to take on this book and read it together. If you're reading that book in your class, you can get copies free of charge. So that's one way to get materials already for free. And then I would say, lastly, you want to document your project history. And this is because institutions have no real memory. And in terms of your longevity of your program, your sustainability, if you're putting down roots at a prison, it's actually quite important to the inmates that you're invested in their long-term growth, because you may be one of the few that is. So documenting your project history also documents for future volunteers the culture of your program, because prisons do have a culture. And whether or not you can plug yourself into that culture, whether or not you can engage with it and change it, I would say is an important thing to think about. And here I would like to interject that we're quite grateful that we work at Oak Hill, because we have an educational program administrator, Jack Rice, and his assistant, Marilyn Williams, who are very invested in the work that these classes do and that the volunteers do. Sustainability and documenting, also you would probably want to think about, you would be well served creating a mission statement and having your volunteers go back to that mission statement. Because again, that's something that it leaves a documentation and archive for future volunteers or for people that are interested in your program, maybe want to volunteer. They can read that and realize whether or not their agenda is the same as yours. And it gives a goal line also for your future. So I would really recommend having a kind of a one-year plan, a two-year plan, a three-year plan, and a five-year plan for your institution if you're only engaging with the prison administration for 1 year. At least having that documentation so that you can pass it on to a colleague is something that's really beneficial, because that's what happened to me. I had a course already ready to go, so we just needed somebody plugged in there who agreed with the mission statement, who could engage with the prisoners and also facilitate the class in a meaningful way. Okay, so now we're going to go to what we've learned. Okay, so I'm just going to say very briefly that we formulate for ourselves what it means to have an ideal classroom and what it means to have an ideal student. That an ideal student is one that comes to you that doesn't cause a lot of problems, right? That does all of the homework assignments. If the class is I'm teaching Russian, somebody that knows all the case endings, somebody that can speak to me in Russian, somebody that basically fulfills all the requirements. And we expect to find these students at top universities, meeting and waiting to greet us there as instructors. And we, in academia, imagine ourselves as on the job market, or I should speak from my own perspective, and the perspective of my colleagues, we imagine ourselves applying for these jobs, which are few and far between with these ideal students. What we do not expect to find is that ideal students are actually in the prison system, and that we're doing ourselves a great disservice by only expecting positions of power and positions of longevity in top universities or the universities even in our communities. That in fact an outreach program at a prison is much more beneficial to you, much more beneficial to the men than you would have ever imagined, because these are the best students I've ever encountered.
I do want to qualify what Colleen is saying. Yes, they are the best students that we've ever encountered. I think we're also very fortunate with the men who are participating in the class, and I just need to point out that the men who are in our class, we have, like I said, between 10 and 15 men, are a very small minority of the prison population itself. Oak Hill has about 700 inmates, and most of the same 15 to 25 men are enrolled in the classes. We do get a few coming in and out, but those men that are self-selecting and are coming into the class are some of the most insightful and innovative thinkers that I've come across in all of my teaching experience. Rather than ending with what I've learned, I just want to talk a little bit about and end with testimonials again from the men and what they've said about the class, specifically in response to a particular question. So like I said, we're getting a lot of publicity as we're both workers in humanities. We get a question often about what's the practical value of teaching literature? What's the practical value of teaching literature in a prison when the classes aren't necessarily credited? So we were being interviewed, Colleen and I were being interviewed for a newspaper article, and the woman who was interviewing us asked us this question. So, you know, and it's kind of couched in this, oh, it's very sweet that you guys are teaching literature, but what kind of practical value do the men get from these classes, especially if they don't have any kind of material results, as in no accreditation? We both had very vocal and loud responses to that. Primarily, what's more practical than treating someone like they're human? And so we then brought this question because I think this is just a very poignant question. And again, I felt it as a teaching moment for me to be, let me see what the men say about this, because I really, I know how I feel about this class, but I want to see if we're actually doing what we are promising and hoping that we're doing for the men. And so we're going to end with some testimonials from the men based on this particular question. First, I have been incarcerated for nearly 27 years. I refuse to believe those years were wasted. In fact, because of the aforementioned classes, I have grown substantially. What I learn, I share with others in this community, and so this process of learning and growing continues, and thus the greater objective has been served.
Also, learning about societies, both modern as well as ancient, helps us cultivate in us a deep love, respect, and appreciation for ourselves and peoples of other nations around the world.
This is one of my favorites. Some texts are great, others not so much. But the literature is always well received and discussions regarding the readings are candid and very lively. Finally.
The Friday night reading class has given me the wonderful opportunity to expand my thought process. I have developed a hunger for meaning. Okay, thank you very much for your time.
Yes, we appreciate your attention and are welcome to answer any questions that you may have.
Great.
Yeah. So we don't have a ton of time for questions, but we have a break afterwards, and then there's lunch, so there's plenty of time to continue this. So, yeah. Oh, and would you mind, if people wouldn't mind saying their name?
Jacob Goodwin from Milwaukee. I applaud the willingness of taking academia outside of normal classrooms. My question is that you focus a lot on the individual benefits to both volunteers and people that are getting this instruction. I mean, you said that they've been done with collaboration and approval with the prison administrators. So I guess wondering about the benefit to the prison system. I mean, it seems also that this could play into both some of the typical conventional understanding that people have of prisons as a place where bad people go to maybe shape themselves up through individual initiative. As much as that reference prison industrial complex, it doesn't necessarily seem that the program you're talking about has capacity to reduce the number of prisons, reduce the type of people that get arrested disproportionately, and also, it doesn't reduce the practice of what the prison is or the systemic torture involved, with the coercion.
Right,
so I guess I wonder if that's something that you
Step by step.
Yeah, and it's not necessarily the goal of the classes. The classes are really primarily to just bring in, like I said, bring in a little bit of humanity to the system itself, to be able to allow the men to, as they say, feel free within the classroom, even though they're still in prison. It's a way for them to escape figuratively. In terms of what other long-term benefits are available, I believe for the prison administration itself, very crudely put, it's a good positive reinforcement of what's being done in a prison isn't necessarily always a bad thing. The Oak Hill Correctional Institute is very focused on offering educational programs. It is a minimum security, and its goal is to get the men released as early as they possible.
I mean, you're working within the confines of the DOC, but I would again like to say that Jack Rice, the educational program coordinator there, is a former teacher, and his assistant Marilyn Williams are dedicated to actually, and they know that recidivism lowers once men have opportunities and women, incarcerated individuals, have opportunities for education and for self-growth. So it's important to know that not all prisons, now we can broadly talk about prison industrial complex, privatization of prisons, but not all prisons are invested in actually having beds filled. So Oak Hill is, again, a little bit of an anomaly in that sense that I think that at least in our terms, meeting with Marilyn and with Jack, they're really invested in getting these men out of the prison and keeping them out.
So I'll just order I have 1, 2, and then 3.
My name is Marge Parsons. I work with a group called Prisoners Revolutionary Literature Fund, and we send revolutionary literature, mainly revolution newspaper, and lots of progressive books like The New Jim Crow, about 800 prisoners across the country. So I wanted to just comment on the you've learned and what we've learned, we get hundreds of wonderful letters from prisoners, some of them barely illiterate, but on a very high level of intellectual engagement
Yes.
with the literature we send. And one of our donors said, if prisoners can change, what else can change? Because I think that, prisoners are considered by society the worst of the worst. And Michelle Alexander said one of the ways they're able to get over with incarcerating 2.3 million people is that everybody thinks, well, they should be there. If they're in prison, they must have done something
Absolutely.
terrible and awful. And I think that certainly our experience and your experience contradicts that, and it shows the human potential that is being locked away in these prisons, and also that people can change, that human nature can change, that, I just think that this is important, and it is important to publicize these kinds of things that go against the prevailing view of prisoners and that make us seriously say there's something seriously wrong here, that there are 2.3 million, mostly black and Latino people being locked up.
It's a great comment. Thank you. We'd love to hear more about your work.
Yeah, when I was an undergrad, I volunteered at a prison, it's a women's prison in Indiana. So, and I did classes and other things. And so, thank you for your talk. And that's just going off of the first question. Yeah, I just noticed, and I've looked at this a lot, that nothing lowers grades ever said other than like education. And I know that like the classes that I volunteered in and like the ones that you're doing are not to help people earn their GED. And when you see the statistics, it says, if you earn your GED, and then if you earn a college degree, and if you earn a master's degree, you watch the percentage for like the likelihood of recidivism goes down drastically. So it's almost nothing. But do you think that, do you have any statistics like about the classes that you taught, even if they're not technically GED classes, or something about the and
It would be great if we did, but because of volunteer status, when you're a volunteer in the DOC in Wisconsin, and I would imagine this is nationwide, you're not allowed to have any correspondence with inmates.
Yeah.
Okay, so and that would jeopardize our involvement at Oak Hill if we contacted individuals to find out where they are at the current moment.
Yeah, so I don't know if there's any way that we personally can track how, like, once the men leave, once they've been transferred, how they're doing, and if the courses they were attending affected that. They're maintaining a parole, their role in society. I don't know, and I also don't know if the prison itself tracks that, or if once they're left off of parole, they're just kind of on their own and kind of do that. They do have.
I know anecdotal evidence is nice, but to have the actual statistics would be wonderful.
Great. There are other reentry groups within Madison, primarily Urban League in Madison, Urban Ministry, that help recently released inmates kind of re-enter society and help them with community and mainly practical skills like finding an apartment, finding a job, being able to integrate in very practical terms. They may or may not have the statistics, but we haven't contacted them to find out if they would know any information either. And that they work with all released inmates and not just the ones from Oak Hill.
Think about it in the future.
Yeah, exactly.
And I'm glad you bring up women's prisons, because we focused on Oak Hill today and the state of incarcerated male population, and we didn't give really any voice to African American women and also incarcerated women in general. So we had to kind of make a choice on terms of time. But
so thank you for this presentation. It was quite great. And I guess my name's Karina Mitchell. I'm an associate professor of English at Ohio State. And I guess my comments sort of piggyback on the things that have already been said. Because this idea of the power of what you're doing, this idea that people can change, I wanted to push back on that simply based on Michelle Alexander's findings, that it's not that people are doing atrocious things that they end up in these places. They are funneled into these places.
yes.
So I was really struck when you said, some of the ideal students are in prison. And I tweeted that because I thought, well, hell, that makes sense. Because the truth is, you don't have to do a lot to end up in the prison system, especially if you're Black or brown. So I thought that was really important to kind of underscore the importance of kind of seeing without the lens of what being in prison is supposed to make you see them as. But the other thing I thought was really striking about the first question you received was, kind of the reminder that there's always more work to do, and that dismantling the prison industrial complex isn't going to happen if we're just kind of feeling good about what we're doing, right?
Yeah.
But I'm also struck by the findings of Dean Spade. He has that book, Normal Life, and it's all about dismantling the prison industrial complex, being very deliberate about not doing things that give more money to the prison industrial complex, right? So kind of in line with what you're saying. But part of what Spade finds is that, okay, at the exact same time that we need to stay cognizant of the need not to fool the monster, we also need to remind ourselves that these people have to have a better life in the meantime, right? Because that dismantling isn't going to happen tomorrow. So in the meantime, what are we doing? And so I just really appreciate your work, and thank you for sharing it with us.
I think it's especially important in terms of inmates of color, because I think it's so difficult to, it's an uphill struggle anyway, and it's an uphill struggle against institutionalized racism, against the institutions themselves, and just and even as a prison inmate, even if you're not a person of color, you're not marginalized, and trying to re-enter, I think, is difficult enough. What I really hope, what I really hope is that when the men participate in the class, I'm helping them just get a way to navigate around the system. The system is not a system that's flawed, and it's not just the prison system that's flawed. It's our social system, it's education system. They're geared towards allowing people who have been privileged to maintain that privilege and kind of staying into that particular system. And so it's really hard to be able to apply for even a community college if you don't have access to the internet, for example. And so I really hope that just having interactions with us, and even if it's not a conversation about the text, but a conversation that we have before class starts or after class starts about, what I want to go to, once I get released, I'd like to look into going to college. What do I need to do that? How can you give me suggestions on how I can start that process? And just having those kind of side conversations may even be more beneficial than the content of the class that we're running itself.
So we'll make this our last question, but hopefully there'll be lots of conversation during the break.
I guess I'm totally excited about your project, and it's really great. But I also just wanted to add to the sort of comment or the kind of issue around why we might think that incarcerated students are the best students in the world. And I think that, as a person who's also worked inside prisons for several years, the context of confinement and scarcity creates something wholly other, a world that's quite different from the outside. So I feel like that those comments should be, I hear a lot of like, my students on the outside are so different from my students on the inside when they're like totally different ages, they're totally different demographics, and what does the context of confinement really do? So I think that's one question, but I think another question is about if, in fact, all the things that you put up there about what reduces recidivism is actually the same for people anywhere, right? If you get a master's degree, your salary is going to go up, etc. And so how does then, how can this project then ask us broader questions about what is the role of education and how is it being limited? And we have sort of university in a prison. I think it goes back to other questions about what is the function of prison, And the last thing that's totally depressing, but I just put it out there for fun, is that during the sort of mass buildup of the prison nation is also the time of where there are programs, right? Before 1994, there's programs all over the country. 10% of people in prison were in college programs, and then after that, those programs often fell apart, but still people cobbled things together. And so it's a question of to a couple other people's points, like, is education really the key to freedom, or is it actually changing really oppressive laws? Or both, So, yeah, just wanted to add that.
Yeah, I'd like to just address the first comment that you made about the contextualizing the classrooms in the prisons, because I do think that's it's a very important piece. And which is why when Colleen mentioned that there are ideal students, that I kind of qualified in terms of that, it's also a very small percentage of the men who are at Oak Hill. Oak Hill itself is a very small facility. We, I think, learned this firsthand because after our first year of working in the systems in 2010, in 2011 we received another HEX grant to try and start a similar reading program outside for newly released prisoners. We called it Community Read. It was billed as a community reading course, which anyone who was interested in just reading and talking about literature could attend, and with the intention of being able to advertise that with the groups who work with reentry. It didn't work, primarily because we didn't have the connections that we need, or when we did contact the people who were working with reentry, such as Madison Urban Ministries, to name a few, and some of the other contact groups for men and women once they've been released. Their primary interest is really the practical goals, like finding an apartment, making sure that people get health insurance, making sure that people get jobs. And while when we approach them, the conversation was like, you know what, this is a really great project. We think that this is really important. We think that it's really useful. It's not our goal, though. And so it was very difficult for us to kind of stand on our own to be able to do it. But also, I think what came out of that, too, is, at least for me, I realized that the men that were in our classes were a really small percentage, because we presented at a job fair that was run by Madison Urban Ministry, and a lot of the men are like, okay, what do you do? And we're like, we're going to read together. And they're like, okay, and move on away.
Like, there's no actual concrete.
And especially for people just releasing, their focus and their goal is, I need to find a job. I need to get an apartment. I need to get health insurance, that kind of stuff. And doing something like reading literature, I think, is a very useful goal, but it's something that comes once people are more settled into the community.
Okay, and also, like, when so for the comments that speak about, my comments when I stated that there are, my ideal students, I should totally have qualified that and stated that, of course, we're dealing with people that are from a totally demographic. What I think I tried to mean there was that in terms of expectations, what you think about your students will be, right? And then having that expectation challenged, right? And also having a model for education that's nonprofit totally changes the discussion in the classroom and the kind of the relationships between facilitator and participant. And so ideal in the sense that in this non-ideal, in this awful situation, you can actually have really quite ideal conversations about literature, things that you wouldn't have access to otherwise. This, for me, is the ultimate, payout, if you want to use those terms. That payout has no actual monetary value to it. For them, for you, it's much greater than that.
Thank you so much. So we need to warm up. It's very cold in here. Oh, fabulous. Okay, the heat will be turned up. But we'll take a break and we'll reconvene in about 15 minutes. Thank you. Thank you. I don't know about having separate videos. Okay, everyone stop it. Thank you.